Does the hashtag resistance stand a chance against the Trump presidency? I'll ask one of the left's most prominent figures, Naomi Klein. I'm Mehdi Hassan. Also on the show, does Hollywood give cover and support to US wars abroad? What is the relationship between the entertainment industry and the military-industrial complex? That's our debate. But first, we're 6 months into the Trump presidency, and it's just one controversy after the next. Yet the president seems to survive and get through every scandal. So can the left, the so-called resistance, come up with a plan to stop him? Earlier, I spoke to the award-winning activist and author Naomi Klein. Her latest book is No Is Not Enough. Klein was a critic of the Paris Agreement, which she believed didn't go far enough in tackling climate change. So I started by asking what she made of President Trump's claim that he could get a better deal.
This is a deal that took a quarter of a century to negotiate. So this idea, the idea that, oh, we'll take another quarter of a century, get a better deal, right? Anybody who has wrapped their heads around just how little time, we have left to avert catastrophic warming, to meet the target set in the Paris Accord to keep temperatures below warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. I mean, we need to be moving so quickly. The reason I called it woefully inadequate is precisely because it is not legally binding, which is what allows Trump to so casually walk away. And I don't want to minimize this. This is a big deal. But the truth is that Americans don't get their energy from Washington, D.C. They get it at the state, from decisions made at the state level for the most part. Now, there's certainly things that can be done at a federal level to encourage states and cities to make the right decisions, but we already knew, whether they stayed or left the Paris Agreement, that the Trump administration was not going to be doing any of those things. They were not going to be introducing a bold carbon tax, which would have put in place the right kind of incentives. So it was really a debate between people in the Trump administration who wanted to stay but ignore it, and people who just wanted to leave openly.
And as you point out, it was possible to stay in and ignore it because it's not legally binding. Trump claimed it was legally binding, or he suggested that was the reason he was leaving. He lied and said, I need to free up our economy from all these global regulations. So given he knows, and he was told presumably it's not legally binding, what do you think the real reason was for him pulling out of Paris, even when his own right-wing advisors are saying, stay in?
Yeah. I think there's always a variety of factors, but I think he needs to throw some things to his base, right? And I think the things that Trump will throw to his base, and he has a hyper-nationalist, Breitbart reading base that basically thinks anything international and global is suspect by its very nature.
Conspiracy against America.
So, climate change is a hoax, but the very idea that the UN could be involved in anything is itself, unacceptable. So he has to throw that base something, because he's going to be betraying them on a lot of other fronts, right? I mean, already we're seeing him break his pledges to protect Social Security. He's breaking his pledges to protect people's health care. And so I think that Paris was just a cheap thing to throw to his base. And the truth is that even though a lot of American multinationals claimed that they were horrified by this, I mean, I think we should take a lot of it with a grain of salt.
You don't think there were? I mean, there were a lot of corporations that said don't pull out of Paris. There were a lot of corporate leaders. There was the Elon Musks of this world who made a big, resigned from his advisory council, said we don't support this. Even Rex Tillerson, his Secretary of State, who's former CEO of ExxonMobil, which has funded climate denial in the past, even he was one of the advisors saying don't pull out of this. So you talk in your new book about the Trump administration being basically a corporate coup, but on Paris, the corporations were not necessarily on his side.
Well, let's look at Exxon and Rex Tillerson, right? Less than a month after the Paris Climate Accord was negotiated, Exxon, under Rex Tillerson, reassured its investors that they predicted that under the terms of the Paris Agreement, oil and gas would still make up 80% of the energy mix globally. Now, that is saying we believe that this accord is not worth the paper it's printed on. Because if the temperature targets are real, we need to be really winding down in the next 20 years. By mid-century, we need to be carbon neutral.
You've said that the United States should face economic consequences, trade and economic sanctions, you say, over this withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. How would that even work? Which country would take the lead on sanctioning the US? Surely that's a liberal fantasy.
Well, I think that things can change. I don't think governments are going to lead this. I think it's going to be the people who lead this.
A people's boycott?
Well, I think it's going to actually start with boycotting the Trump brand. And I think gradually we're going to see pressure put on governments to take an increasingly hard line in the face of the Trump administration.
Okay.
And why not, right? I mean, Trump is threatening sanctions from everybody who doesn't, abide by whatever his latest dictates are, and I think it's a logical response.
Okay, so we'll come back to the Trump brand in a moment. Just before that, you and many other high-profile activists, commentators on the left were criticized for not actively encouraging people to vote for Hillary Clinton in last year's election to stop Trump. Given how narrowly Clinton lost and how catastrophic Trump has been, especially on the environment, even in his short time in office, do you regret not taking the stronger Noam Chomsky line, say, that progressives in swing states should definitely vote for Clinton to stop Trump?
I told people to vote against Trump. I didn't endorse Hillary Clinton. I did endorse Bernie Sanders because of his positions on climate.
He wasn't on the ballot paper in November, obviously.
Well, look, I was not trashing Hillary after she lost the primary.
But in terms of the choice, you're saying you did actually say after the primaries, vote against Trump.
Yeah, I did say that.
Naomi Klein, today you're at the forefront of what is often called the resistance against President Trump. You, of course, wrote the book No Logo about how corporations and branding had taken over our public spaces, our democracy. You wrote The Shock Doctrine about how supporters of the free market exploit crises, tragedies, disasters to get support for their policies. Is Trump, in many ways, a culmination of everything that you were writing about and warning about over the past 20-odd years?
Of a lot of it. And certainly what I was writing about in No Logo now almost 18 years ago, this rise of these super brands or hollow brands, where companies that understood that their product was not their product. Yeah. Their product wasn't the sneaker or the laptop or the running shoes or the condo, but an idea, an aspiration. And so people started getting their identity through shopping, through their identification with brands. And Trump is a master at this. And his relationship with his base is not like the traditional relationship of a politician and the people who voted for him who then hold him accountable. It is this relationship of celebrity. It's this relationship of identification, of deep identification. So when you attack Donald Trump, you are attacking them. That's the feeling.
And one of the resistance tactics you write about in your book in relation to corporations is culture jamming, where activists, quote, identify the big, bold idea a company is selling and then expose the dirty reality behind the shine. You suggest in your book applying that tactic to President Trump to hurt his finances and to hurt his image. But will that work? Because we've heard so much about Trump's finances, his business empire, the conflicts of interest, the lawsuits, and he's still standing. His business is still expanding. Nothing seems to stick to this guy.
Well, you're definitely not going to impact his brand by showing that he cheats, by showing that he lies, by showing that he treats people like garbage, because his brand is being the boss that gets away with anything. Yeah. His brand really is impunity that comes from tremendous wealth. I mean, this has been what he has been selling, and there is a market for it, particularly among men who feel that their power is diminished on various fronts, and he's selling this sort of cheap fix of easy power, right? That's why it's fun to identify with Trump for a certain psychology. There are some things that really do bother Trump, like saying he's not actually the boss, that somebody else is pulling the strings.
President Bannon.
President Bannon. I mean, look at how Bannon's public profile has receded. I mean, they've really been keeping him in a box. I still think he is politically influential, but it's clear that upstaging the president is not okay because it does impact the thing that is most precious to him, which is his brand. But look, I want to be very clear. This is not going to be enough to take on Trump. The only thing that's going to beat him is an alternative that is actually tangibly improving people's lives with real good jobs, with better health care, free education, the economic populist program. And this is one of the reasons I supported Bernie.
So would you
I believe
agree,
he is a way better foil to Trump
So you
than
mentioned
Hillary.
Bernie there.
Yeah.
Bernie's not part of the Democratic Party. He quit as soon as he lost the race for the nomination. Are Democrats getting the resistance to Trump right? Because there's a lot of obsession about Russia for very legitimate reasons.
Yeah.
There's talk of impeachment for very legitimate reasons. But is that allowing Trump to get away with awful healthcare bills, deregulation of Wall Street at the dead of night behind closed doors? Are Democrats getting their opposition and resistance to Trump wrong, in your view?
A lot of Democrats are. I mean, I think there are exceptions. I think Elizabeth Warren is trying to tap people on the shoulder and go, look over here, while everybody is talking about Russia, which, yes, needs to be fully investigated. I think there is certainly, enough suspicious behavior to merit that, right? It has to happen. But does it need to be 90% of the coverage on MSNBC? Does it need to be, do Democrats need to put all of their eggs in this basket, whereas really going after this core broken promise that I'm going to stand up for the little guy, the working man, and looking systematically, connecting the dots between his tax policy, his healthcare policy, his attacks on regulations, and how all of it is systematically transferring wealth from the lower and middle incomes to the 1% of the 1%. I mean, I think that has much more of a chance of reaching Trump voters than focusing exclusively on this hope of impeachment by Republicans. Look, the Republicans are the only ones who can impeach Trump.
Yeah.
And they will only impeach Trump when they believe it is in their interest. And he's not advancing their economic agenda, which he is.
So a lot of the discussions around Trump and resisting Trump are full of doom and gloom. How do you stay optimistic, hopeful about the future in an age of Trump?
I mean, I'm not sanguine, I mean, I am frightened. On the other hand, we are in this moment when the neoliberal consensus, the ideas that have constrained our imagination for so long, are in complete crisis. And so those dangerous ideas are not the only ones that are rising in this moment. There is also a resurgence of progressive imagination, of boldness, and an appetite for it. And I think we saw this so clearly in the response to Jeremy Corbyn's campaign. And I guess what I'm trying to focus on is the fact that what is happening on the left side of the political spectrum is as significant as what is happening on the right side of the political spectrum and deserves our attention and our care and our planning.
There's a danger of complacency, isn't there, on the left? Because at the end of the day, Corbyn, wow, did really well. We all rightly point out the achievement. But he lost at the end of the day. He didn't actually win the election. Bernie Sanders did very well, came close to a historic upset, but still lost.
Absolutely. I mean, look, the left, genuine progressive candidates are coming closer to power than at any point in my lifetime, within arm's reach of power. The responsibility of this moment is tremendous. Of course, we can't be complacent, because if we can win, if we're finding that we can win, that a progressive majority is within reach, then we have to win. Bernie would have won if he had had a message that resonated with 50% of black voters, because Hillary got upwards of 90% in many states. Why didn't that happen? Why is this such a perennial problem for the left to connect deeply with the people who are most impacted by the ravages of economic inequality? But these are weaknesses that we have to be honest about, and we need to build a winning coalition.
Naomi Klein, thank you for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.
It's been a year since Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte came into office and launched a violent campaign to rid the country of drugs. But is that really what he's doing? UpFront producer Kieran Alvey has this week's reality check.
Rodrigo Duterte, the Philippine president, has waged a controversial drug war he says will save his country.
Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now, there is 3 million drug addicts. I'd be happy to slaughter them and save the next generation.
Despite his government's alarming, internationally denounced actions, the majority of Philippine citizens are actually satisfied with his anti-drug campaign. And U.S. President Donald Trump congratulated him on the unbelievable and great job he's doing. But despite the fact that methamphetamine use is rising in the region, Duterte has exaggerated the drug problem in the Philippines to justify an inhumane war, one that doesn't even address what experts say is the main cause of drug use: poverty. which afflicts more than 20% of the population. Instead, his aggressive drug war has mainly targeted the urban poor, who are most often unemployed or working in menial jobs. Duterte himself doesn't deny it. But killing the poor has never ended drug use. Many say meth use is high in the Philippines, mostly among young, poor men who work long hours, because it's a cost-effective solution to having nothing to eat but needing to work until you drop. And the chance to make money has driven countless others into the drug trade. Today, many have turned themselves in out of fear of being killed, including non-addicts, only to be sent to prisons 400% over capacity, which have been called schools for crime. Meanwhile, another problem's emerged. Vigilantes, death squads, police have been accused of leaving thousands of suspected drug users and pushers murdered in the streets, and making money off extrajudicial executions. This unaccountable violence has even led to people naming their enemies as drug suspects just to get them killed. In fact, things got so out of hand that in January 2017, Duterte suspended the anti-drug police unit, calling them corrupt to the core. But they relaunched just 2 months later, and with a name like Project Double Barrel Alpha Reloaded, it's no surprise the death toll has been rising again. This war may lead to thousands more being killed outside the rule of law, or even to Duterte being charged with crimes against humanity. But what it won't do is save a country from drugs.
From Iraq and Afghanistan to Yemen and Syria, the US military has been keeping busy. But what role does Hollywood play in all of this? Is it a tool of Pentagon propaganda? And has the demonization of Muslims, and especially Arabs on the big screen and small, helped normalize, justify even, US military interventions in the Middle East? Joining me to discuss this today are Heba Amin, a visual artist and researcher based in Berlin, who shot to fame in 2015 after drawing subversive graffiti on the set of the US TV series Homeland, and Dr. Roger Stahl, an associate professor at the University of Georgia, whose book and documentary Militainment, Inc. trace the relationship between Hollywood and the US military. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Roger, in your book Militainment, Inc., you say that in order to understand US militarism, especially in the Middle East, we should not just look to presidential speeches and public debates, but we have to understand the role played by Hollywood. Why, and what role specifically are you referring to?
Well, if we look at where our narratives come from in terms of US foreign policy or European foreign policy, you know, the first draft of history is written by journalists like yourself, but as it settles in, you know, most people's experience of war and overseas military intervention, really, it comes from Hollywood and television. Because most of this experience is not, of course, firsthand, it's mediated.
And I'm guessing you think those narratives are not accurate narratives, historically accurate or politically neutral.
Well, like all narratives, they're told by somebody and they represent certain institutional interests. In order to understand how those narratives get to the screen, we have to understand who's producing them and, you know, what the background machinations and deals are that eventually, you know, produce what gets onto the screen.
Heba, I mean, you're nodding your head. You, of course, were involved in Homeland, the US TV series about the CIA. Very popular, lots of fans, but also lots of critics who criticize its portrayal of countries like Lebanon, Iran, Pakistan, and its portrayal of Muslims. You, as a visual artist, were commissioned by the show to draw graffiti on the set for a particular episode, and you used those scenes to write things like Homeland is racist and Homeland is a joke in Arabic on the background. Why did you do that?
Well, I mean, we really wanted to critique Homeland's conception of authenticity and how they, as a purely aesthetic vision of violence. And so, you know, it's known that Homeland collaborates with the CIA, and in previous seasons they had made many mistakes about the Middle Eastern narrative and the South Asian narrative. A show like Homeland really approaches culture as set decoration. And so Homeland, of course, whose show actually takes place in the Middle East, doesn't do the thorough research and doesn't have a deep understanding of what those narratives are in the Middle East, and as a result has made many faux pas and many very kind of grievous mistakes about political narratives that in turn affect the people who live there.
Roger, in CIA-related shows like Homeland, 24 and others, what's driving some of those simplistic, Heber talks about simplistic narratives, sweeping narratives? We see it happen with Muslim communities when we're talking about the war on terror. We see it happen with Latin Americans when you're watching shows or movies about the war on drugs. Is Hollywood producing content like this simply out of sheer ignorance? Or is this a deliberate decision by producers and studios to work with the US government, to collude maybe with the Pentagon or the State Department or various security agencies?
To the extent that the CIA or other intelligence agencies have their fingers in the production of these shows, they're looking to legitimate their operations. They're trying to address controversial issues. They're trying to secure congressional funding for the future. They're trying to send a message overseas about how powerful they are and whether their purpose is noble.
Roger, you're almost suggesting that Hollywood movies, TV shows end up being used as propaganda tools by elements of the national security establishment. Is there any way of measuring the effect that they have on US public opinion about US foreign policy? Or are these just theories? Are you speculating when you say, this influences this policy, this justifies that strike, this legitimizes that piece of torture?
Well, there aren't complex and sensitive tools for measuring effects of that nature. What you can do is look at the institutions that are making these deals. You can look at script changes. You can look at public interviews that producers give regarding their relationships. And you can look at how the narrative of officially sponsored films and television shows changes over time. And it's fairly consistent. I mean, if you look at CIA-sponsored productions like 24, like Zero Dark 30, and Homeland, I mean, you just mentioned the subject of torture. And in all three of these shows, I mean, they basically treat the subject of torture in the same way, which is it ought to be used. We don't like to use it. We ought to use it, though, because it extracts useful information and keeps us safe.
I understand that point, but they would say, the producers of those shows, the writers would say, we're reflecting public debates. We're not causing the public to support torture or encouraging the military or the CIA to carry out torture. We're artists. We're reflecting what's out there in the real world. That's our job.
Well, to some degree, they're doing that, but they would not be working with the CIA or with the Pentagon if the Pentagon objected to the narrative that they were portraying. So you have to look at it as, they're trying to reach a number of audiences, and one of those audiences is the national security establishment with which sometimes they have a very close relationship.
Heber, what do you think actors and producers and directors and the studios, what do you think they get out of these kind of relationships? Do you think it's one-way traffic?
Well, I mean, I also just want to bring up the point, since we did talk about 24, and just to say that the same producers in 24, it was a show that did more than any other show to legitimize torture, and in fact was used in a very real life situation in the Supreme Court. So if we start to pretend that artists are merely reflecting their surroundings, when in fact there is an interplay between the real world and the creative world, we really have to start to address the ways in which the entertainment industry is really complicit.
And Heber, you're Egyptian, you currently live in Germany, you've traveled across the Middle East. Do you think Hollywood has the same effect on audiences outside the US as it does on audiences in the US? Surely non-Americans don't buy into some of this quote-unquote propaganda about US foreign policy as easily as many Americans do. Or do they?
Well, I mean, I can't purport to represent everyone in the Middle East, of course, but of course it has a wide range of effects. And one of them is that I think many people feel very frustrated in the ways that not only how they're being depicted in Hollywood, which has very kind of wide-reaching arms, but in fact, in turn, how that really affects real-world politics. You can't convince an entire country to go into an illegal war in the Middle East without having previously convinced them of a certain kind of image of a bad guy. And Hollywood plays a very big role in perpetuating that image.
So someone like myself, if I'm a fan of Homeland and 24, is that bad? Is that wrong? Because people would say, you know what, I leave my politics at the door when I go into a cinema. I can be very anti-war in real life, but watch lots of war movies for fun.
Well, I mean, entertainment is not apolitical, and in this kind of globalized world that we live in, and given the current crises that we're experiencing, I think we can't extract ourselves from these situations. Ultimately, we're all complicit in these narratives. So as a viewer, I think you have to be conscious of what it is that you're supporting and whether those are in line with your ethical and moral beliefs.
Roger, given you've got Hollywood studios making a lot of money from some of these big budget films, winning Oscars for films like Zero Dark 30 about the CIA and torture, and on the one hand you've got them making money, on the other hand, as you say, the US government, Pentagon, CIA gets obvious benefits from working with actors and studios. Do you see any chance of any kind of change or reform to these relationships?
It requires a certain kind of critical awakening. I mean, in an ideal world, I suppose I would like a law that would require the CIA to stamp its logo on the front side of every movie as you walk into the theater. But short of that, we have to do a lot of critical work in order to understand that these relationships exist.
Roger Stahl, Herbert Amin, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me for this fascinating, very important conversation. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.